It was said that an arrogant art critic was about to bring the gavel down on the sale of a generation-defining masterpiece when a quiet, colorblind man stood up and ruined his day with 3 simple words: "I painted that." The world laughed at the absurdity, a cruel, echoing sound in the hallowed Hall of Commerce. But the laughter, like the critic's career, was not destined to last the evening. 00:01:30. The Sovereign Gallery did not smell of art. It smelled of money, a scent so potent it was almost a taste, metallic and sharp, like old coins held too long in a sweaty palm. It was the odor of calculated desire, of legacy laundering and tax sheltering masquerading as cultural appreciation. The air itself, chilled to a precise 68 degrees Fahrenheit, hummed with the silent, tireless work of climate control systems protecting canvases worth more than the collective yearly income of the city block outside. Light, meticulously curated by unseen technicians, fell in stark, dramatic pools upon the chosen few artworks, leaving the gathered patrons in a reverent, expensive twilight. They were creatures of this specific ecosystem, women in severe black dresses that whispered of exorbitant price tags and men whose bespoke suits were a form of armor against the indignity of ever being questioned. At the center of this universe, upon a polished mahogany rostrum that resembled both a pulpit and a block of execution, stood Julian Croft. He was not merely an auctioneer, he was the high priest of this temple of valuation. His suit was a shimmering midnight blue, tailored so perfectly it seemed fused to his body. A single, flawless pearl gleamed in his tie, a miniature moon orbiting the planet of his ego. His voice, when he spoke, was a magnificent instrument, a resonant baritone that could soothe a nervous bidder or flay a hesitant one with a single well-aimed syllable of contempt. He was a maestro of avarice, and this auction was his grand symphony. He was currently warming up his orchestra, dispensing with a lesser piece, a minor impressionist work he described with the thinly veiled boredom of a god swatting a fly. "A charming little riverside scene," he declared, his lips curling into a smile that did not trouble his eyes. "A pleasant enough distraction for a guest bedroom, perhaps. We shall start the bidding at a modest 50,000. The words "charming" and "pleasant" were daggers, and the painting, under the weight of his disdain, seemed to shrink on its easel. Far from the gravitational pull of the rostrum, almost swallowed by the deep shadows near the service exit, sat a man who was the antithesis of everything the Sovereign Gallery represented. His name was Elias Vance, and he was a ghost at this feast of opulence. His tweed jacket was clean but softened by age, its elbows worn to a gentle suede. His gray trousers were creased from a long bus ride, and his shoes, though polished, were undeniably ordinary. He sat on a small, velvet-upholstered stool that seemed to reject him, an island of quiet integrity in an ocean of performance. He was not alone. Holding his hand, her small fingers a warm, living anchor in the cold, sterile room, was his daughter, Lily. She was 8 years old, with eyes that held the same unnerving stillness as her father's. While the crowd gazed at the art with the predatory assessment of investors, Lily was watching the people, her expression one of profound, childlike confusion. She could not understand the language of this place, the hushed, urgent whispers, the sudden, sharp intakes of breath that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with possession. Elias's own eyes were the most remarkable thing about him. They were a flat, uniform gray, like a photograph taken on a cloudy day. They held no flicker of blue or brown or green, possessing an unnerving depth that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. To the world, Elias Vance was completely colorblind, living in a permanent state of monochrome. He saw only shades, values, and luminance. He saw the world as a symphony of light and shadow, a truth that was both his burden and his secret, unimaginable gift. His gaze swept over the room, but it did not register the jewels or the silks. It registered the way the light caught the sharp angle of a jawbone, the deep shadow beneath a contemptuous brow, the subtle gradient of darkness in the corner where the ceiling met the wall. He was seeing a different reality, a world stripped of its gaudy distractions. The minor painting was sold with the final, dismissive bang of Julian Croft's gavel. A polite, restrained ripple of applause followed. Then a hush fell over the room. The air grew heavy with anticipation. The technicians, with practiced theatrical slowness, removed the charming riverside scene. The main lights dimmed further, and a single brilliant beam of pure white light stabbed through the darkness, illuminating the main easel, which was draped in a shroud of black velvet. 00:05:45. And now, Julian Croft's voice boomed, dropping an octave into a tone of manufactured reverence. The moment we have all been waiting for. A piece that has, in its short time in the public eye, redefined the very concept of neo-expressionism. A painting of such impossible vibrancy, such transcendent use of color, that to gaze upon it is to feel the world made new. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He was a master of the pregnant pause. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Achromatic Dawn. Two assistants, moving with the silent grace of acolytes, pulled the velvet cloth away. A collective gasp, sharp and genuine, swept through the gallery. It was the only honest sound of the evening. The painting was a supernova of color. It depicted a mountain range at sunrise, but it was a sunrise from a dream, a hallucination of beauty. The colors were impossible, shades that should not exist in nature, let alone be mixed from mere pigment. Pinks bled into violets that shimmered with an inner light. Deep oceanic blues held flickers of incandescent gold. The snow on the peaks was not white, but a complex tapestry of 1,000 different pale hues that somehow, together, created the idea of white, a white more pure than any white that had ever existed. It was a paradox on canvas. Its beauty was so profound it was painful, a direct assault on the senses. The room was mesmerized. Even the most jaded collectors, men who used Rembrandts as placemats, were stunned into silence. Julian Croft beamed, his face a mask of triumphant ownership. He had brought them this god, and he would now sell it to the highest bidder. A breathtaking work, discovered only last year, Croft continued, his voice now a conspiratorial whisper. The artist is unknown, a mystery that only adds to its allure, a singular, explosive talent who appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. We will begin the bidding at $5 million. The number hung in the air, heavy and obscene, and into that silence, a voice, quiet but clear as a bell, spoke from the back of the room. That painting is mine. The spell was broken. 100 heads swiveled in unison, a flock of startled birds. Their eyes, accustomed to the brilliant light of the masterpiece, struggled to focus on the shadowy figure of Elias Vance, who was now on his feet. I painted it, he repeated, his voice not rising, not challenging, but stating a simple, unadorned fact. For a moment there was only stunned silence. Then it began. A single, disbelieving snort from a man in the front row. A woman's titter, quickly suppressed behind a gloved hand. And then, like a contagion, it spread. A wave of low, cruel laughter rolled through the gallery. It was the laughter of the secure, the powerful, the entitled, confronted by something so utterly outside their frame of reference it could only be a joke. Julian Croft, on his rostrum, let the laughter swell, a conductor savoring a crescendo. He looked down his patrician nose at Elias, a monarch observing a particularly impertinent peasant. A slow, venomous smile spread across his face. This was an unexpected gift, a moment of theater to make the night even more memorable. Did you hear that, ladies and gentlemen? Croft boomed, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. It seems we have the mysterious artist in our midst. Step forward, sir. Step into the light. Do not hide your genius in the shadows. Elias did not move. He remained where he was, a small, unmoving pillar against the tide of ridicule. Lily squeezed his hand, her small body trembling. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Let's go." "It's all right, sweetheart," Elias murmured, his voice for her alone. "The light is just a little harsh in here." Croft's amusement began to curdle at the edges. The man wasn't playing his part. He wasn't shuffling his feet, or stammering, or wilting under the collective glare of 100 millionaires. He was just standing there, calm, defiant. "You," Croft said, pointing a long manicured finger at Elias. The word was an accusation. "You claim you painted achromatic dawn. This masterpiece of color and hue?" He leaned forward, his voice becoming a weapon. "My dear man, look at you. That jacket has seen more decades than you've seen dollars. You cannot afford the frame, let alone the genius required to fill it." More laughter, louder this time, more confident. The pack had its quarry. "I do not care about the frame," Elias said, his voice still level. "I care about the painting. It was stolen from me. My name is on the back." This simple declaration, delivered without a trace of anger, seemed to enrage Croft more than any shouted insult could have. The man's serenity was a personal affront to his authority, to the entire curated reality of the room. "Your name?" Croft spat the words out. "And what name would that be? Picasso? Van Gogh? Let me guess, you are the reincarnation of Titian himself." He turned to the crowd, playing for their approval. The arrogance, the delusion. He then turned back to Elias, his eyes narrowing into cruel slits. He would break this man. He would dismantle him, piece by piece for the entertainment of his clients. "Tell me, then, maestro," Croft sneered, adopting a mock academic tone. "If you are indeed the artist, you would surely know the precise chemical composition of the cerulean pigment used in the upper quadrant of the sky. Specifically, the stabilizing agent used to prevent metameric failure under halogen lighting. A simple question for the creator, no? It was a brutal, esoteric trap, a question designed not for an answer, but for humiliation. Only a handful of paint chemists and art restorers in the world would know that. The crowd murmured, impressed by Croft's casual display of arcane knowledge. They leaned forward, eager for the kill. Elias did not answer immediately. His gray eyes were fixed on the painting, not with the analytical gaze of a chemist, but with the deep, sorrowful gaze of a father looking at a long-lost child. "There is no cerulean," Elias said finally, his voice soft but carrying in the sudden silence. "There are 17 distinct layers of phthalocyan in blues and greens, laid over a base of zinc white and marble dust. The shimmering effect you see is not pigment, it is texture, microgrooves carved into the gesso refracting the light. You are not seeing a color. You are seeing a trick of the light, a memory of light." The room went absolutely silent. Not the hushed, reverent silence from before, but a dead, stunned silence. The technical jargon, delivered with such quiet authority, was utterly unexpected. It was as if a beggar on the street had suddenly begun reciting Shakespearean sonnets in perfect iambic pentameter. Julian Croft's smug smile faltered. For a split second, a flicker of uncertainty, of pure, cold shock, crossed his face. He had expected a stammered denial, a confused silence. He had not expected this, but his ego, a vast and powerful muscle, quickly reasserted control. The man was a charlatan, a clever one, but a charlatan nonetheless. He must have read a technical journal, memorized a few phrases to sound convincing. 001230. "Impressive," Croft said, his voice tight, the smooth baritone now strained. "You've done your research. A commendable effort for a common fraud, but this farce is over." He straightened his tie, a gesture of reasserting his dominance. His face was now a mask of cold fury. The game was no longer amusing. It was an infection that needed to be cleansed. Security! Croft's voice cracked like a whip, echoing in the cavernous space. Two large men in black suits who had been standing impassively by the entrance started to move. They were large, solid men, their faces blank and professional. Remove this person from the premises. He is trespassing and attempting to disrupt a private auction. I want him charged. Attempted fraud, public nuisance, whatever you can make stick. I want him to understand that there are consequences for this kind of pathetic stunt. The guards moved towards Elias, their polished shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. They were closing in, their presence a promise of overwhelming physical force. The crowd, sensing the shift from theatrical humiliation to genuine menace, grew uneasy. This was no longer entertainment. Elias did not move. He did not brace himself. He simply watched them come, his expression one of weary resignation. He had known it would come to this. He had hoped it would not. But he was a man who dealt in truth, and the truth of this room was that it could not tolerate a reality it had not paid for. He squeezed Lily's hand. "Close your eyes, sweet girl," he whispered. From the side of the room, near a service corridor, a young woman watched, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her name was Clara Jenkins, and she was an intern, a position that granted her the privilege of being invisible. She was an art history graduate, her head full of theory and her heart full of a pure academic love for art that was being systematically eroded by every day she spent in this place. She had seen Elias earlier that day, before the gallery had opened to the public. He had been standing in front of the veiled masterpiece, his daughter by his side. There were no guards, no crowds, just the two of them and the silent, shrouded painting. He had not been looking at it with awe or curiosity. He had reached out a hand, stopping just an inch from the velvet, his fingers trembling slightly. His expression was one of such profound, gut-wrenching loss that Clara had felt like an intruder and had quickly looked away. Now, hearing his quiet, technical dismantling of Croft's question, a wild, impossible idea began to form in her mind. She had also overheard his whisper to his daughter. "Don't worry, Lily. The colors are just light. I can see the light." It was a strange thing to say, but it resonated with something her grandfather, a frustrated landscape painter, used to tell her. "The amateurs paint with color," he would say, cleaning his brushes with turpentine-soaked rags. "The masters paint with light." Clara looked from the incandescent painting to the gray, unassuming man about to be hauled away like a piece of trash. She saw the absolute certainty in his posture. She saw the terror and trust in his daughter's eyes. And she saw the vicious, insecure fury on the face of Julian Croft. In that moment, a moral calculus resolved itself within her. Her career, her internship, her carefully planned future. All of it suddenly seemed less important than the sickening injustice she was witnessing. As the guards reached Elias, placing heavy hands on his shoulders, Elias's mind detached. The pressure on his tweed jacket, the sudden sharp scent of the guard's cologne, the rising murmur of the crowd, it all faded into a distant hum. His consciousness slipped backward in time, seeking refuge in the memory that was the source of both his pain and his power. 00:17:15. He was back in the room. It was not a room so much as a cell, a cube of whitewashed stone with a single, large window facing north. There was a bed, a table, a chair, and an easel. Nothing else. For 5 years this had been his entire world. The atelier of light. It was not a school, but a monastery for artists who sought to transcend the physical. His master, Alistair Finch, stood beside him. Finch was a man who seemed to be woven from shadow and dust, ancient and timeless. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were like stones dropped into a deep well. "Look again, Elias," Finch's voice commanded, soft yet unyielding. On the easel was a simple white canvas. In front of it, on the table, was a single red apple. To Elias, the apple was a dull, medium-gray orb. It was an object defined only by its shape and its value, the way light and shadow fell across its skin. "I see gray," Elias had said for the 1,000th time. "I have always seen gray." "Good," Finch replied. "Color is a lie. It is a surface-level distraction, a sensory indulgence for the undisciplined eye. The world screams with color, and so people have forgotten how to see. But you, Elias, your affliction is your purity. You're not distracted. You see the skeleton of the world. You see the truth." Finch picked up the apple. "This is not red," he said, his voice laced with contempt for the word. "It is a complex surface that absorbs every frequency of light except for a narrow band, which it reflects. It is a dance of absorption and reflection. That is all. Your task is not to replicate the lie of red. Your task is to capture the truth of its light, the luminance, the way it pushes back against the shadow. You will learn to paint the soul of the apple, not its skin." For years, that was his training. He did not learn to mix colors. He learned to mix values. He worked with a palette of 27 grays, from the purest white to the deepest black, each one a precise, calculated step in luminance. He learned to see the infinitesimal shifts in light that no normal eye could perceive. He learned to create the illusion of heat with warm grays and the feeling of cold with cool grays. He learned to paint the weight of a shadow and the buoyancy of a highlight. Then came the day Finch brought him the pigments, a rainbow of them. "You have learned the language of light," Finch had said. "Now, I will teach you how to translate it for the blind." He taught Elias to understand color not as a visual sensation, but as a scientific fact. Each tube of paint was labeled not with a name, but with a number, its precise value on a grayscale, its refractive index, its opacity. To Elias, a tube of cadmium yellow and a tube of ultramarine blue might look almost identical in their gray world value, but he learned their properties. He learned how they would interact, how one would absorb light and the other would scatter it. He was not a painter mixing colors. He was a physicist arranging molecules. He was composing a symphony he could never hear. Achromatic dawn was the culmination of that training. But it was not an exercise. It was a prayer. It was a memory of the last sunrise he had seen with his wife, Elara, before the tumor in her brain had taken her. He remembered the colors of that morning with a phantom clarity, a description she had whispered to him as she lay in his arms. "The sky is a bruised purple, my love," she had said, her voice weak, "and there's a sliver of the most impossible pink, like a flamingo's feather." He had painted it for Lily, to show his daughter the one memory of her mother he could not describe in words. It was his soul on a canvas, a translation of his love and his grief into a language of light he himself could not see, but one he understood more profoundly than anyone. A trusted associate of the atelier had arranged for it to be sealed and preserved, but the man had been a Judas. He had stolen the painting and sold it into the dark, murky channels of the private art market, where it had eventually surfaced here, a nameless masterpiece, its story erased, its soul for sale. A sharp pain in his shoulder brought him back to the present. A guard was shaking him, his grip tightening. "Let's go, pal. The show's over." But as the guard began to pull him away, a frantic, breathless voice cut through the room. "Wait! Stop!" It was Clara. She had burst from the service corridor, her face flushed, her uniform disheveled. In her hand, she clutched a slim file folder. All eyes, including the guards, turned to her. Julian Croft looked as if he was about to have an aneurysm. "Miss Jenkins," he roared, "what is the meaning of this? You're fired. Get out." Clara ignored him. She ran forward, stopping just short of the guards. She was shaking, but her eyes were bright with conviction. "You have to listen," she pleaded, looking not at Croft but at the gallery's owner, a portly, nervous man named Mr. Abernathy who had been trying to remain invisible. "I found the provenance file," the private one. Abernathy's face went pale. That is confidential. The seller was anonymous, Clara pressed on, her voice gaining strength. But they left a note. It said the work was acquired from a private collection associated with something called the Atelier of Light, and it listed a number, for emergency verification only. The name Atelier of Light meant nothing to most people in the room. It was a myth, a whisper among the highest echelons of the art world. But to Mr. Abernathy and to Julian Croft, it was as if she had just spoken the name of a vengeful god. Croft's fury was instantly replaced by a flash of genuine fear. "I called the number," Clara said, her voice dropping, but every person in the room heard it. "I told them what was happening." Abernathy looked like he was going to be sick. "You did what?" he whispered, horrified. It was at that exact moment that the grand double doors at the main entrance of the gallery swung open. They did not burst or slam. They opened with a silent, inexorable weight as if pushed by a tide. The chattering, the whispering, the movement, it all ceased. A profound, absolute silence fell over the sovereign gallery. The very air seemed to solidify. 002500. Standing in the doorway were 5 men. They were dressed in identical, severe, dark suits of a cut that was both timeless and intimidating. They stood in a V formation, and they did not look at the art or the crowd. They looked forward, their faces impassive, their posture radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. From behind them, a 6th figure emerged, stepping into the center of the formation. He was an old man, frail and leaning heavily on a simple wooden cane. He was small, almost bird-like, but he commanded the space around him with an intensity that dwarfed everyone in the room. His eyes, deep-set and fiercely intelligent, swept across the scene, taking in the opulent crowd, the terrified gallery owner, the furious critic on his rostrum, and the 2 guards holding the quiet man in the tweed jacket. It was Alistair Finch. Julian Croft's face, which had been a mask of rage, crumbled. The color drained from it, leaving a pasty, sickly white. He knew that name. He knew that face from whispered legends and grainy photographs in forbidden art journals. The man was a ghost, a myth. He was not supposed to be real. Finch and his entourage began to walk forward. Their steps were measured, rhythmic, and perfectly in sync. The sound of their leather-soled shoes on the polished floor was the only sound in the universe. It was not the sound of walking, it was the sound of judgment approaching. They did not stop to address the gallery owner. They walked past the front row of stunned billionaires as if they were furniture. They completely, utterly ignored Julian Croft, who stood frozen on his rostrum, a statue of his own shattered arrogance. The procession came to a halt directly in front of Elias Vance. The 2 guards, who a moment ago had been embodiments of brute force, seemed to shrink. They looked at the men in suits, then at the ancient, powerful man leading them, and a primal instinct for self-preservation took over. They let go of Elias's shoulders and took a half-step back, their professionalism evaporating in the face of a higher, more terrifying authority. Alistair Finch's piercing eyes softened as they rested on Elias. He looked at the quiet man, then down at the small, frightened girl holding his hand. A look of deep, paternal sadness crossed his face. He leaned forward, not with the creak of old bones, but with the grace of a king, and gave a small, formal bow of his head. "Master Elias," Finch said. His voice was quiet, raspy with age, yet it carried through the cavernous, silent room as if he had shouted it. "It is good to see you, Lily." He nodded to the girl. "I'm sorry we are late. There was some traffic." The word master detonated in the silence. It was a title of supreme respect, of deference. To hear it applied to the shabby, quiet man in the tweed jacket by a figure of Alistair Finch's mythical stature was to witness the world turn upside down. A collective cognitive dissonance rippled through the crowd. Julian Croft finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, sputtering croak, a pale imitation of his earlier boom. "Director Finch? What? What is the meaning of this? This is a private event. This man is a fraud. He was attempting to—" Finch turned his head slowly and fixed his gaze upon Croft. It was not a glance. It was an act of annihilation. Under that gaze, Croft felt his lungs seize. He felt pinned, dissected, and found wanting. All the air, all the arrogance, all the carefully constructed authority he had built over a lifetime vanished. He was a small, loud child being silenced by a true adult. "You will be silent," Finch said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, and Croft was. Finch turned his attention back to the room, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the wealthy patrons. "My name is Alistair Finch," he announced, his voice gaining a cold, hard edge. "I am the director of the Atelier of Light, an institution you are not privileged to know, but whose standards you have grievously violated tonight." He gestured with a frail hand towards the painting, still glowing under its spotlight. "Achromatic Dawn is not for sale. It has never been for sale. It is the private, personal property of its creator, Master Elias Vance." He let that statement hang in the air, a final, unassailable truth. Then he began the dissection. "You people," he said, his voice dripping with a contempt so pure it was almost beautiful. "You call yourselves collectors, connoisseurs. You trade in beauty, but you know nothing of its nature. You see a flurry of bright colors and you applaud, like infants shaking a rattle. You are blind, all of you." His gaze fell again on Julian Croft, a hawk returning to its prey. "And you are the worst of them all, a merchant of noise. You stand on your stage and you pontificate about pigments and provenance, but you wouldn't know true art if it set you on fire. You mocked this man. You humiliated him." Finch took a slow step towards the rostrum. "You mocked him for his sight. You thought his color blindness was a weakness, a deficiency. You fool. His achromatopsia is the very source of his genius. While you are distracted by the gaudy, meaningless riot of color, Master Elias sees the truth. He sees what is real. He sees light itself, value, luminance, the very bones of the universe." He pointed a trembling finger at the masterpiece. "You think that painting is about color? That painting is a mathematical proof rendered in oil and light. Every single hue on that canvas is calibrated to a precise value, a specific refractive index. It is a symphony of luminance composed by a man who cannot see the colors, but who understands their soul. It is a skill that cannot be taught, only honed through decades of monastic discipline. A skill that none of you in your loud, bright world could comprehend in 1,000 lifetimes." The room was utterly still. No one breathed. They were being stripped bare, their ignorance laid open for all to see. "This painting was not made for you," Finch continued, his voice lowering to a near whisper which was somehow more terrifying. "It was not made for auction. It was a gift, a memory of a sunrise, painted for his daughter, so that she might see her mother's last moments through his eyes. It is a piece of his soul. And you," his voice rose to a roar, "you put a price tag on it." He turned to Elias. "Master Vance, forgive my theatrics, but ignorance of this magnitude must be met with overwhelming force. There is a detail in the painting, is there not? In the deepest shadow of the largest peak, something no one but the artist could possibly know." All eyes, 100 pairs of them, swiveled from Finch to Elias. They were no longer looking at a madman or a fraud, they were looking at a prophet. Elias's gaze was still on the canvas. He nodded slowly. "There is a single brushstroke," he said, his quiet voice filling the vast silence. "Hidden in the darkest gray, which you perceive as black. It is a stroke of pure titanium white, mixed with ground alabaster. It has the highest possible refractive value. It is invisible to the naked eye under this light." He paused. "It was the last thing I added. It represents my wife's final breath." One of Finch's men stepped forward. He was holding a small, high-intensity laser pointer that emitted a thin beam of ultraviolet light. He aimed it at the spot Elias had described, at the deepest, darkest part of the mountain's shadow. And there, suddenly, it was. A single, impossibly brilliant spark of light bloomed on the canvas. It did not look like paint. It looked like a captured star, pulsing with a cold, pure fire. It was a secret, a signature written in the language of light itself. A collective, shuddering sigh went through the room. It was the sound of 100 realities shattering at once. Julian Croft made a small, choking sound. The blood had drained from his face so completely that his skin looked like parchment. His lips were blue. He swayed on his rostrum, his hands gripping the lectern to keep from collapsing. He was not just wrong. He had been proven wrong on a cosmic scale. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed a sacrilege, and he had done it in front of the entire world. Finch's men moved. One produced a sheaf of papers and handed them to the trembling Mr. Abernathy. "This is the preliminary legal filing," he said, his voice flat and cold. "The Atelier of Light is suing the Sovereign Gallery for trafficking in stolen art. We will be auditing every transaction you have made for the past 10 years. We will dismantle your reputation, and then we will take your gallery." Two other men in suits walked to the rostrum. They did not touch Julian Croft. They did not need to. They simply stood on either side of him. Their presence was a cage. "Mr. Croft," one said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "you will be coming with us. There are some questions we need to ask you about your acquisition protocols, and about a certain stolen masterpiece." Croft did not resist. He couldn't. His entire being had been hollowed out. He looked small, shrunken, a cheap costume of a man with the actor gone. He stumbled down from his rostrum, his legs barely holding him, and was escorted towards the exit, his head bowed in utter abject humiliation. The great auctioneer, the high priest of value, was being led away like a common criminal. 003530. The immediate aftermath was chaos, but a strangely silent, panicked chaos. Mr. Abernathy, his face slick with sweat, rushed to the front of the room, wringing his hands. "The auction is cancelled," he announced, his voice a squeak. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, the gallery is now closed." He then scurried over to Elias, his face a grotesque mask of fawning apology. "Mr. Vance, Master Vance, I am so sorry. A terrible mistake, a misunderstanding of epic proportions. We had no idea. Please, is there anything at all we can do?" Elias looked at the man, this purveyor of status who was now debasing himself so completely. He saw no triumph in it, only a deep, weary sadness. He did not reply. Alistair Finch stepped between them, a frail but impassable wall. "You will do nothing," Finch told Abernathy, his voice like chipping ice, "except cooperate with our investigation. You have done quite enough." Finch placed a protective hand on Elias's shoulder. The gesture was both gentle and possessive. "Come, Elias, Lily, let us take your painting and go home." The men in suits, moving with practiced efficiency, carefully lifted Achromatic Dawn from its easel. They handled it not like a commodity worth millions, but like a sacred relic. They wrapped it in a climate-controlled, padded case they had brought with them. Finch and his men formed a protective phalanx around Elias and Lily. As they began to walk towards the exit, the crowd of patrons who had been frozen in shock parted before them like the Red Sea. The whispers started again, but they were different now. They were whispers of awe, of fear, of disbelief. The world had been rearranged, and they were all struggling to find their new place in it. As they passed the spot where Julian Croft was being quietly but firmly detained near the door, Elias paused. The former critic was a wreck. His perfect suit was rumpled, his face was ashen, and tears of pure, selfish despair streamed down his cheeks. He was not weeping for his crime, but for his fall. He looked up, and his eyes met Elias's. He expected to see gloating, triumph, or righteous anger. He saw none of that. Elias's gray eyes held only a profound, heartbreaking pity. He looked at the broken man, a man who had lived his entire life in a world of vibrant color and had seen none of its true beauty. "Art is not for selling," Elias said, his voice a quiet murmur, almost lost in the cavernous room. "It is for seeing." The simple statement landed with more force than any blow. It was not an accusation. It was a diagnosis. It was a final, devastating summary of Julian Croft's entire wasted life. Croft flinched as if he'd been struck, a raw sob escaping his throat. Then Elias, his daughter, and their protectors were gone, disappearing through the grand doors into the night, leaving behind a room full of shattered illusions and the cloying, suddenly cheap smell of money. 0, 0, 40, 0, 0. The months that followed were a slow, brutal demolition of a world. The achromatic dawn incident, as the press gleefully dubbed it, was not a stone thrown into a pond. It was a tectonic plate shifting beneath an entire industry. Julian Croft's fall was as swift as it was total. The questioning by Finch's men had unearthed a career built on kickbacks, insider trading, and a willful blindness to the dirty provenance of any artwork that promised a high commission. He was not just a fool, he was a crook. He was publicly excoriated. The Sovereign Gallery, under the legal assault of the Atelier of Light, was forced to open its books, revealing a cesspool of corruption that implicated dozens of other collectors and dealers. Croft was the sacrificial lamb. He was blacklisted from every major auction house on the planet. His columns were dropped, his television appearances canceled. His name, once a synonym for taste and authority, became a punchline, a shorthand for arrogant, high-gloss ignorance. The legal fees and penalties devoured his fortune, forcing him to sell his art collection, the very symbols of the status he had worshipped, for a fraction of its value. The epilogue to his public life was a photograph in a tabloid, showing him in a cheap cafe, unshaven, his eyes vacant. He was staring at a glossy magazine on the table. The cover story was about the art world's newest sensation, Elias Vance, the Master of Light. The systemic changes were seismic. The fear of the Atelier of Light, an organization that had proven it could reach anywhere and dismantle anyone, forced a new era of transparency. Provenance, for decades a matter of winks and nods, became a forensic science. Galleries and auction houses invested millions in verification technologies and research departments. The art world, kicking and screaming, was forced to acquire a conscience. The Atelier, having made its point, stepped partially out of the shadows. It established the Ilara Fund, named after Elias's late wife, a multi-million-dollar foundation dedicated to protecting artists from exploitation and recovering stolen works. It became a powerful, benevolent force in the art world, a quiet counterpoint to the loud, brash world of commercial galleries. Elias, for his part, vanished from the public eye as quickly as he had appeared. He refused all interviews, all offers of gallery shows, all requests for commissions. He had not sought fame or validation, only justice for his stolen soul. With his painting returned, he and Lily moved to a small, quiet house in the countryside, paid for by a grant from the Atelier that was, in truth, an apology. Achromatic Dawn was not hung in a vault or a museum. It was hung on the simple plaster wall of their living room, opposite a large window that looked out onto a garden. It was not a masterpiece. It was a family portrait, a memory of a wife and a mother, glowing with a light that only two people in the world could truly understand. Elias began to teach, taking on a handful of students, not to create more painters, but to teach people how to see. A year to the day after the auction, a man appeared at his gate. He was thin, dressed in simple, worn clothes. It took Elias a moment to recognize the ghost of Julian Croft. The arrogance was gone, scraped away by humiliation. The booming voice was a hesitant rasp. "Mr. Vance," Croft began, not meeting his eye. He looked at the gravel path. I don't know why I'm here. I don't expect you to forgive me. What I did was unforgivable." He looked up, and for the first time, Elias saw something other than ego in the man's eyes. He saw a hollowed-out emptiness. "They took everything," Croft whispered. "The money, the houses, the reputation. And you know what the strange thing is? I didn't miss any of it. What I missed, what I realized I never had, was the ability to see what you see." He gestured vaguely with his hand. "I've spent the last year in museums, not the big ones, small ones, looking at paintings, not for their value, not for their history, just looking, trying to see, trying to understand what you meant." Elias listened, his expression unreadable. He did not offer comfort. He did not offer absolution. The universe had already balanced those scales. He simply nodded toward the open door of his small studio, where a blank canvas stood on an easel, catching the afternoon light. "Apologies are words," Elias said, his voice as quiet and steady as it had been in the gallery. "They are ghosts of the past. Art is action. It is what you build in the present." He looked at the broken man who had lived a life of judging others and was now utterly without judgment himself. "What will you do now, Mr. Croft?" It was not a question of forgiveness. It was a question of redemption. Croft looked from Elias's calm gray eyes to the waiting, empty canvas. For the first time in his life, he had no answer. But for the first time in his life, he felt the desire to find one. Elias had not given him a pardon, but something far more valuable. A purpose. He turned and walked away, not as a fallen critic, but as a student, with a long, difficult lesson ahead of him. Elias watched him go, then turned and went back inside, to his daughter and to the quiet, beautiful light of his world.